Welcome back, everybody. Today we are continuing our series for revisiting D.gray Man chapters with chapter 2 or night 2, A Full Moon Night. And this is an interesting chapter because of the anime repercussions of it, where this chapter and the next few actually move behind the following arc and eventually is considered as episode 5 and 6 rather than being what it should have been episode 2 and 3, including having a character who was not there be here for the big reveal that occurs in the following chapter, which I'll talk about more in that chapter. But I do want to first recover what I missed from the original chapter 1 or night 1 opening. So the first thing was that when the Earl meets up with Pastor Mark's Akuma and then disappears when Moa arrives in the room, he's using Noah's Ark there, which is something we know from future knowledge. But at the time, you could just assume it was him using teleportation powers. And if he had those anyways, I don't think it changes the story all too much. But it is a cool nod that we do get to see how that happens at this point. Secondly, I don't cover Alan's character card at all, which is at the end of chapter 1. And there are some references to Zone. It's introduced that he is around 15 years old right now, but the key thing is that Alan's birth date is unknown, which means Hoshino had plans to manipulate Alan's age, as we know she does, later in the story. Okay, so that's kind of the key stuff I wanted to cover, as well as I didn't mention Zone, the D.gray Man one-shot that came out that introduced the story and is kind of the reason why D.gray Man exists at all. I'll probably cover that in a later video, but I do want to cover this series first. So, anyways, the chapter kind of picks up sort of where the last chapter did, but also not. Alan hitched a ride with some circus folk because, he has those circus connections. And he's just kind of riding with them into a new town as he's on his way to the Black Order, headquarters in England. And they're asking, like, is he just a traveler? Like, what are you doing? Are you sightseeing? And he's like, no, I'm going to the Exorcist headquarters, as well as we get to see Tim Campy for the first time, because he wasn't in chapter 1, he was just in the cat's stomach the whole time, where Alan is actually concerned that Tim Campy will get eaten again, ultimately saying, don't fly around. And that is how we are introduced to Tim Campy. Tim Campy actually does fly out of the cat's grave, apparently, which makes no sense because the Akuma star poison literally makes the body turn to ash. So where Tim Campy was doesn't make sense. But whatever, it was just meant like why he wasn't in chapter 1. He came out of the grave after chapter 1, apparently. So after that, we do get cut into a backstory of how Alan is on his way to the Order and why he's on his way specifically. And he's in India, which was mentioned in chapter 1 when Mo was like, where's your master then? He's like somewhere in India. And Alan is officially allowed to become an exorcist by Cross, because Cross is one of the 5 generals of the Order. And he's like, you've been traveling with me for 3 years. I think you've done enough now to officially become an exorcist. Alan is super excited about this, but then we find out that Cross doesn't want to go to the Order with him because he hates the Order. So he's like, Tim Campy can lead you there, and then knocks him out so that Cross has enough time to run away. And at the end of the chapter, we see like just a 1 page of just Alan being knocked out in the middle of India. But you're probably wondering why was this such an abrupt transition in the chapter, but it's because Alan actually was remembering this in a dream, and it causes him to wake up in like a cold shudder, so much so that the carnival folk are like, are you okay? And before he can really even say anything, he just hears someone yell, it's an Akuma. And Alan dashes to the area where it is, where he's just met with a bunch of other people who also probably heard the yelling. And Alan's like, where is it? And then everybody's like, there's nothing here. This little kid was playing a joke on everybody. You got to stop crying, wolf. And the kid's name is John, who is the son of one of the scientists at the Black Order. And they're all just like, this kid, you got to stop doing this. But he's like, I saw it. I saw this guy turn into a Akuma. It's not like he was an Akuma and then turned back into his human form. He seems to have saw the Earl make a contract with somebody, is what's being implied here. And nobody's believing him. Obviously, Alan does because Alan can see the souls of Akumas with his eye. Once again, not introduced why he can see the souls of Akuma. It might just be a given ability of an exorcist. That might be what's implied here. But as we learn in the next chapter, that is not the case. So all the grown-ups kind of leave except for one, who grabs at John, and he's the Akuma. And he's like, finally they're gone. I'm going to kill this kid. And John's like, oh no, am I going to die? But luckily Alan, who's there, just no diffs the Akuma because it's not even in its spherical form. And we actually get to see a really cool art here of like when he swipes at the Akuma's head, like the skin kind of peels off and then it shows the machine underneath. We already knew it was an Akuma because of the star on its head, but it is very cool visuals that I don't feel like we had to see that much, and then it explodes. And he's like, are you all right, John? Who jumps on him being like, oh my god, you're an exorcist, this is so cool. I've been trying to fight the Akumas all the time. I'm going to become a scientist when I grow up and wipe out all the Akumas. You see, my dad is a scientist at the Black Order, so I've learned about Akumas through his journals. And he's just like also dissing Alan, despite Alan just saving his life, being like, you're not what I expected as an exorcist. I thought they'd be all like muscular men, and you're just not. I mean, even in the chapter page that I just mentioned from chapter 1 on Alan, it is mentioned that Alan's kind of inspired by a female character for his design. But John just like is so interested in kind of like the nature of exorcists because this is the first one that John has met. And he's like, how many Akuma have you destroyed? And he just keeps asking questions for then Alan to be shutting him down, to be like, it's better you don't look into this anymore. You don't want to get the Earl's attention. It will be really bad for you. You have no way of defending yourself. For your own good, just please stop. And John kind of refuses to. He throws one of his onion bombs at Alan, and Alan starts crying. And it's like interesting how it just jumps so smoothly from Alan a second ago being such a badass, destroying the Akuma, to now it's like crying his eyes out. And John just runs away, being like, I might be a kid, but I'm not going to let these I'm not going to let these Akuma take over my town. And he runs home, and he lives in like a nice big mansion. And he's just in his room with like keep out signs until the maid comes to say that your friend Leo is here. And we get to see Leo for the first time here. And he's like, long time no see. He does mention that Leo hasn't seen him since Leo's mother's funeral. And he seems a little off, which, as we all know from chapter 1, is not necessarily a good sign. He had a tragedy, a soul, and potentially a machine to cause Leo to do this. Now, you could be at this point hopeful that Leo isn't an Akuma because he knows about Akuma from like working with John to protect the town. But I feel like we all kind of know at this point, and by the end of the chapter, it's confirmed that he is an Akuma. So they're just like chatting it up because Leo now, as an Akuma's goal is to bring John to the Earl so the Earl can punish him for all of his transgressions and like raising awareness of Akuma. Not that I think it really matters, given that Leo still chose to make a deal with the Earl despite knowing about what Akuma are. But John just keeps going on at this point about like he saw an Akuma for the first time. He even saw the Millennium Earl's face. And he saw like the reason he knew that was an Akuma was he saw like the machine going into the human body, which is a very awkward thing to see, as we saw in chapter 1. And he draws the goofy picture of the Earl, which I do think we see multiple times throughout the manga, but this is officially the first time we see it. So he's like, let's pass this out to everybody, make everyone aware of what the Earl's doing, and make sure that nobody looks for the Earl and makes a deal with them and creates Akuma. So this is all going well, and then Leo's like, I want to show you a place. And John, as his best friend, is like, sure, let's do that. Alan, of course, is like, I'm too good-spirited. I have to make sure this kid is set on the right path before I leave for the order. I can't just leave him to his own devices. So he knocks on Leo's door. It's like John's door. And John pushes his maid on top of him so that he can run away from Alan. And they both run away. And we see Alan's iconic eye that we saw in chapter 1 change color and zone in on like the back of Leo. And he says, "Wait, John, that boy is." And we never get to see what he says, finishing that at least right this second. So he's like, "This is bad. We have to follow him." And then Alan says right here, "I might end up introducing myself to him first, Master," which implies right here that Cross might have never met the Earl yet. And it's a similar thing to Muzan, I guess, with Tanjiro and Demon Slayer, where Tanjiro is the only person to see Muzan's face, unlike all the other Demon Slayers out there, and knows it's him. But the Earl also does have interactions with others, as well as the fact that, as we'll learn in future chapters, this isn't the first time Alan meets the Earl. It might just be the first time Alan meets the Earl as his official enemy and an exorcist. So John and Leo end up going to the cemetery, and John actually thinks maybe he just wanted to show me his mom's grave and like so we can say hi to her. You know, he's still mourning her loss. He's feeling different. I'm just going to assume this is the case. And he's like, "Yeah, sure, we'll pay our respects." And then he bumps into somebody, and it's the Earl, who's like, "Good evening. Nice to meet you, John." And I'm surprised the Millennium Earl is actually taking time out of his day to deal with somebody like John. I know he is raising a lot of awareness about the Earl, which is probably the reason he is doing this. But you'd assume he could just bring Akuma. Without an exorcist or somebody like a crow, you really can't destroy Akuma, even level 1 Akuma, that easily. But he decides to go himself. Maybe it's just because he wants to send John into absolute despair. And he throws his onion bomb at the Earl the same way that he threw it at Alan. But unlike Alan, he just gets ticked off. Like, we get to see really creepy eyes from the Earl. And while that's happening, John's like, "We got to get out of here. We can't take on the Earl right now. I don't have my super weapon. I haven't created it yet." And Leo's not moving, and Leo's just smiling. And John's just like confused. "Why aren't you moving, Leo?" And he's like, "Oh, poor John. You see, your friend died on the day of his mother's funeral. He chose to become an Akuma." Well, not chose, but like chose to bring back his mom, ultimately creating the cycle of him becoming an Akuma. And John is like, "You're lying. That can't be." But then we are interrupted by Alan joining the fray and saying, "It's true, John. That boy is the Millennium Earl's Akuma," which ends the chapter. Like I said, there's the one shot at the end of the chapter of just Alan being knocked out and Tim Campy floating above him so that General Cross can get away and not take Alan to the Order. But this is such an interesting chapter because it introduces our main character to like our main bad guy this early in the story. And looking at it now with our whole context, I think there are definitely a few things where it makes sense in some of the next few chapters, such as Alan fighting some of the Akuma here, that the Earl doesn't take out Alan. But it is interesting to see them interact, and that Alan, from this, does end up becoming one of the names that Tiki Meek has to get rid of from the playing cards. But nonetheless, fun chapter, I guess. We do get to see interesting characters like John, who, once again, a lot of these characters we don't really get to keep in the story. It's just Alan and Tim Campy until he gets to headquarters and meets up with the other exorcists, like Lena Lee, who would have been here in the anime canon of the story. Well, like I said, this is a shorter chapter because I feel like a lot of the crazy stuff happens in the next few chapters, including what I'm super excited to talk about, Alan's backstory, especially because of the confusion that happens with Mana, as I'm sure a bunch of you know. Anyways, if you stuck around for the whole time, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. And I hope you also enjoyed the font that I chose to make audio only. I'm not really that into editing, and I kind of just want to make these videos for the sake of, like, enjoying and spreading the D.gray Man community. So I'm sorry if like you wanted these videos to have like expertly edited clips from the manga. I might do that later on, but for now, I just want to like make these, talk about it, and then send it out. So if you stayed the whole time, thank you. Maybe think about subscribing, and I'll talk to you later.